Welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Author series. My name is Amy Perry, and I'm an adult services specialist with the library. I have the pleasure of introducing tonight's author. Rona Simmons has authored historical fiction and nonfiction works. Her newest book, A Gathering of Men, and her previous book, The Other Veterans of World War II, Stories from Behind the Front Lines, both shed light on little-known aspects of the Second World War. She is the daughter of a World War II fighter pilot and wife of a U.S. Navy pilot, and is proud to honor veterans and their stories through their work. Rona is also the winner of the 2022 Military Writers Society of America Gold Medal for Historical Fiction. Please give a warm welcome to Rona Simmons.
Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you to the Gwinnett County Library for hosting me this evening. It's a pleasure. I actually learned something. I didn't know it was Military Family Month, but Veterans and Military Family Month here in November. So not only are we celebrating Veterans Day next week, but the entire month will be devoted to military families and our veterans. So thank you so much for coming. I hope all of you have a connection with the military, with one of our wars, even if not World War II. I'll be speaking mostly about World War II because that's been my passion. And I will talk a little bit about why the military, why me, how did I get this interest? Because a lot of people say, well, no, I was not in World War II, but I have learned a great deal about World War II and our military. I say the military runs through my family. My grandfather on my mother's side is up there on the top left. He was in World War I. Sadly, I don't know exactly what he did, and I need to do more research to find that out. And then this is my father in his P-38. He was a World War II fighter pilot, as Amy mentioned, and he lived to be 97, so I had the great fortune of being able to talk to him about the war. And this is a picture of my father-in-law's World War II B-17 bomber crew. He flew out of England during the war, and we'll talk about that. And this handsome gentleman in the white is my husband, who was a Vietnam-era Navy pilot. Although he didn't go to Vietnam, he flew helicopters in the North Atlantic. Now, up top is my mother. I always say, you've heard of Rosie the Riveters, women who volunteered. Well, my mother was way too vain. She was not going to put on dungarees and go to work in factories. She modeled, however, holding the 100th shell made by a company in Indianapolis in her hometown. And then this is my brother-in-law, who was in the Marines, and my nephew, who was in the Iraq war during the Army during the Iraq War. So I've touched just about all of them that of recent history anyway. So that of course spurred my interest. I also was, because of my father's service, I was raised in a military family. And being military meant you were on the move. Thanks to my mother, who's pictured here with our family that's me in the back right there. My father again, and my mother homeschooling probably before homeschooling really was known to be the thing. But we moved around. That's what that era, World War II, after the war, that's what you did. If you were in the Air Force, you were moving every 6 months or so. I had 18 homes by the time I graduated from high school. So that was one every other month, or every 6 months or so, which was pretty normal. The good news about the Air Force families is we generally went with my father. So when he went to Europe, we went to Europe. When he went around the country, we went around the country. So it was not like being in the Navy, where you might not see your father, or your mother might not see her husband for months at a time. But it made a very different growing up period. I think a lot of people who have lived in one place all their life have a hard time understanding what it would be like to be uprooted and put down in a new city, a new town, or stand at the head of the class and meet the new kid in the class, which took a while to get over that feeling. But it also, I think, was a great upbringing. We learned a lot about different places and different cultures. But that meant that I had so much history and so much desire to know about history when growing up. And being able to talk to my father when he was in his late 90s about the war led me to the idea to write this book, The Other Veterans of World War II, Stories from Behind the Front Lines. If you write a World War II book and you decide you'd like to see it published, and you approach a publisher, their first reaction is one big yawn. I mean, all they could say was, another World War II book. Why should we publish this? They could fill this library branch with books on World War II and probably most of the other branches here in Gwinnett County. So you have to find a different angle. And so when I decided, I met a few veterans from World War II. This was about 10 years ago. And I started talking to them and realized that there were people who had yet to tell their story. You know, you hear about fighter pilots, you hear about bomber pilots, you hear about a lot of people, but you don't hear about the people who worked behind, what I call behind the front lines. And if you talk to most of them, they'll say, well, I didn't do anything special. I don't have a story to tell. And I said, oh, yes, you do. And we're going to sit down and figure out what that is. I ended up talking to 20 veterans about their story. And when I would meet one of these people, I'd say, I'd have to find out, because I decided to do the book about non-combat veterans, those who serve behind the lines. So I'd say, you know, what did you do in the war? And if they said, well, I was on the front lines and, you know, fought the Nazis or went through Italy, I'd say, well, thank you very much. But when I met someone who was behind the front lines, I said, if I'm going to spend time with you and have you tell me your story and share some moments you may not have said to or talked about to anyone else, you are going in my book. I will make sure that your story makes it into that book. And I did. I met people who, one of the gentlemen was with the Graves Registration Service. His job in the Army was to bury our fallen soldiers right after a battle. And he did it with great honor. Another gentleman lent me his 200 letters his father wrote home to his mother. And I got to read them and really feel like I was there firsthand. And then this gentleman, who is actually from Atlanta, was a photographer. And when he went into the Army and he was in Germany, he got the orders to go down to Buchenwald. Now, Buchenwald might mean something to you and me, but Buchenwald meant nothing to him. It was just another town. I mean, they didn't know. And they said, take your camera and go down there. I said, well, what do you want me to do? He said, take your camera and go down there and go see. And luckily he did. His photographs today are in the National Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., one of the few. And he himself said at the time, I got there and entered the prison of the concentration camp and saw the people who had been captured there and tortured and deprived of many things. And he said, I took a few pictures and then I put my camera down. I couldn't do it. Thankfully, he had taken a few pictures that remain with us today. But I think after interviewing, while they have fascinating stories, and people say, well, why did you do this other than to tell their stories? And I point to this picture. This lady worked on the Manhattan Project. She was from Flowery Branch. The Manhattan Project being the secret project to develop the atom bomb. Now, she was not in there mixing the ingredients or anything, but she did work in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And when she was there, she was told, now, of course, this is secret, and you cannot talk about what you did, ever. And so she left the Army later, moved on with her life, and she was in her 90s here, and she developed complete Alzheimer's and could remember nothing. Thankfully, her son took her videos of her 10 years prior to that time. So he lent me those videos and I got to watch them. And when I finished the book, and I insisted each one of the veterans have their photo on the front of their chapter, and she saw that photo and that's her reaction. And I said, that to me is what doing this is all about. It's just so genuine. She was so thrilled, even though she couldn't remember. And if you said, Joyce, now what is it you did? She'd go, zip my lips. She would not talk, even to this day. So after I finished that book, I decided, you know, I didn't have to go talk to 20 strangers. I could talk to my father, who also said, even though he was a fighter pilot, I didn't do anything special. I said, I'm sorry, I don't buy that. But I decided to do a different story. And this is my husband and his father. And I decided to tell their story because, again, it had to be something different. And that story ended up in my second book, A Gathering of Men. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. He had died back when he was 47, back in the 60s. So he didn't leave anything behind. And my husband had, of course, very few memories just growing up till he was in college. We did know that he was born in 1917 in Wilmington, North Carolina. He graduated from New Hanover High School, and that's him up there about that time. He joined the Coast Artillery Corps right before the war. And then he transferred to the Army Air Corps because he wanted to fly like everybody else. He wanted to have those wings. He earned his silver wings and became a B-17 pilot, and this is his picture then. So we knew that, and that was about all we knew. Very little was left. So we started doing some research. Now, a lot of World War II people have something that looks like this, an old, worn manila folder with lots and lots of faded pages, crumpled pages in them. They're about that thick. And they were given their orders. And when, you know, today, of course, it would be electronic, I'm sure, on your cell phone. You were told not to lose it. But they would be given these paper orders to put in their folder and take with them to war, and they're all over there carrying their manila folders. So it grew and grew. And when you got orders to go overseas, you didn't get one piece of paper. They typed them in the 10s and 12 copies. So you got 10 or 12 copies sending you, and you put them into your folder, and you carried that around. So we had that envelope, but it said he left on such and such date and listed the articles that he took with him, and that he had a gun, and he had 3 sets of uniforms, and you know, but that still doesn't tell you very much. St. Louis. Everybody know what happened in St. Louis? In 1973, the Veterans Administration, who housed all of these records, the originals, burned. Records for everyone from World War II through about 1970, I'm not quite sure the day, were in that house, and unless you had your papers in your possession, they were gone. They managed to save boxes like that and begin transcribing them for posterity and digitizing them. So there was a little more information. We wrote away, and we did have a copy. This is one of these faded pieces of paper that were in this manila folder and retrieved from the St. Louis Library. It listed the names of the people in his crew. So we had a few more tidbits and were able to start piecing together the story, as well as what's known as a DD-214, if you're in the military, a discharge paper. So again, dates and facts were coming together. We learned, though, these were his flights, and he was stationed in England, like many of the World War II bombers. Some were stationed in Africa as we moved into Germany and started fighting there, or into France and then into Germany. Others were fighting, taking off from England and moving into the continent and bombing this area. So we were able, from those records, to piece together each one of these of his flights. So his first one was down here to Friedrichshafen, and we know the date and what he was with, the whatever they call the Bloody 100th. Some people have heard of that bomber group that was out of England. They were known not because they lost more people, but because they had more people lost in a very short period of time during one phase of the war. So this was his first flight in 1942, and then he continued to go into France, into the Netherlands, into Germany, close to Switzerland, but of course they were neutral, so just over the border, and into Germany, some at Munich and Regensburg, some very, very difficult towns. When they would make these flights, of course they'd take off, and they'd go off into the into the English Channel, form up, and sometimes there would be 1,000 planes that we would send on one mission. And I mean, you can't even imagine, it was probably the busiest airport in the time. Now we think of Atlanta as being the busiest airport. These guys would take off, and it would take them 2 hours to just keep circling in the channel until they got into their formation, because you knew that you were a third group behind that group, and they were the third group behind the next group, and you just kept circling and circling until you formed up. And then they would take off en masse and come over to one of the cities that they were to bomb that day. And of course, sounds easy, right? There were German fighters looking for them as they came across and hoping to shoot them down. Well, we do know, so we followed these flights, and we found his last flight was up here into Germany. Now, when you went over as a B-17 pilot, you had to finish 25 missions before you were allowed to come home. That's when your tour of duty would be up. And we think, well, 25 missions, I'll be home in a month. Well, no, it didn't quite work like that. Most guys took about 6 months, 9 months to get 25 missions in. Because these missions were 9 hours, 10 hours. And so you couldn't just come back the next day and get on a plane and go again for 9 hours. I mean, a lot of recuperation. And they were being shot at. Or they'd have engine trouble, or an engine would catch fire and they would have to land somewhere or go back and hopefully make it back to England. So it wasn't an easy thing to do. But then we found out that about midway through the war, they said we were losing so many men and so many planes were being shot down or having maintenance problems. They told the people, and you can imagine, you've done your 20th mission. Your 21st, your 22nd, you're saying, oh, 3 more. And guess what? Notice comes from Washington that you now have to do 30 missions. So you keep flying, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, and guess what? Washington says you have to do 35. So these men had to keep going. Now, most people did finish and did go back home. And it depends on if you were early in the war, you came home after 25, later in the war, you came home after 35. And yet there were men who volunteered and stayed on or went back and may have done 50 missions. So just an incredible number. But he didn't. He finished his 21 missions. The last one was over Munich. And we found out, there was a newspaper clipping about what happened on that final flight. And you can't see it here, but basically, this gentleman, Tom Mackenzie, was the bombardier. So he was down in the bottom of the plane where he would control the bomb bay doors. He would open them up when they got over the city and let the bombs go. He did. And they kept flying. And he's supposed to bring the bomb bay doors back closed so they can continue their flight. The doors didn't close. So finally somebody sent someone down there, because you had to get up out of these very small seats and climb through the plane. Now you're way up here in freezing weather, and because they didn't have heated airplanes, and so they climbed down to see where he was, and he had been shot. Their plane had been shot from the bottom. He was wounded, and his arms were severely wounded. He couldn't manage to close the bomb bay doors. So another gentleman who went down to see him closed the doors for him, and they continued on the flight. But my husband's father was the pilot on this flight, and he realized what was going on, and these guys had to tend to Tom Mackenzie, who was the bombardier. That meant they needed to take their gloves off, because they're wearing these very thick gloves because it's so cold. If they take those gloves off, their skin would freeze. So he managed to He realized what was going on. He took the plane down to a lower level where they didn't need their oxygen and where it wouldn't be so cold, and they administered to him, and he did survive. And my husband's father landed the plane and never flew again. Now, that was mission number 21. He had 4 more to go, and that's all we knew. That was it. There, the story stopped. So he did survive. He was sent home. My husband grew up, finished college, and then his father died. And he never spoke of the war again. But we still wanted to know. I mean, my husband knew that my father is here. He's 97 years old. He has lots of stories. He really wanted to be able to know what happened to his father. So we kept on going. Just to give you an idea, in his group, there were 4,700 men in his bomb group. And when you look at that, there were 500 pilots, and this is over the course of the war for this particular unit. 451 co-pilots, 400 bombardiers, 500 navigators, 500 radio operators, 500 tail gunners, 500 top turret gunners, and then ball turret gunners, 500 and 850 waist gunners, because you have a gunner on both sides. One on the right waist gunner and one on the left waist gunner. So out of those 4,700, each one of these little blue men represents 10 people. There were 2,700 who completed their tour of duty, who made their 25 missions and went home. That's those guys. There were 800 who were killed in action or killed in the midst of combat, maybe not actually on a plane or in a bombing mission. There were 1,000 who were prisoners of war out of that 4,700. And there were 120 who were transferred or who had the designation RFS on their records. RFS means removed from flying status. It meant you could no longer fly for various reasons. A lot of the ones who were transferred, now this is just of this one group, and there are 150 groups in England alone, so multiply this times all those men. He was one of these men, and on his records are RFS. He was removed from flying status after that 21st mission, and we still didn't know why. Many of these, at the time, they were very sensitive. The commanders on the station knew that if I put an RFS on your records, that is not something that you're going to be very proud of. It's not something you want to talk about. And so they would tend to put an XFR, transferred. You were transferred from being a pilot to maybe being a personnel officer or doing some training or something around the base, or transferred to another base. Unfortunately, about half of these were transfers, and so we don't know really whether maybe there was something else medically wrong with them. They just said transferred. In his case, he received an RFS. And that was the point where I said, this story needs to be told, because no one talks about those people. They came home and could not talk about, I searched, I never found a person who had been removed from service, removed from flying status, who told their story, which made us want to know even more what exactly happened. Now, there were many stories about the people who didn't fly. And you can't read this by any stretch, but this was the form that said, if you decide you want to learn how to fly, or you want to be a pilot, these are the qualifications. You had to have 20/20 eyesight. You wore glasses, you weren't going to be a pilot. You could not be colorblind. You had to be minimum 5 feet and 105 pounds, maximum 6'4", because the cockpits are tiny, and 200 pounds. So you can decide whether you would fit and could make it as a pilot or not. These two gentlemen were both veterans who were in my first book, The Other Veterans of World War II. They wanted to be pilots. Everybody wanted to be a pilot. If you've heard stories, you may have seen movies where after Pearl Harbor, everyone ran down to enlist. They just, put elbows and shoved people out of the way to get down to the recruitment center first. Do you know why? Well, great. They were patriots. They wanted to defend their country. They wanted to go help the cause. But mostly, they had been told, if you go enlist rather than wait to be drafted, you get to pick which service you want to go in. So you go, oh, well, that's not quite so. And that is a true fact. However, the part they didn't know was, all these men rushed down there. They didn't need that many pilots. So once they had filled up all the pilots, the Army was going to tell you what you were going to do. So not everybody got to be a pilot. And these two gentlemen did rush down. They wanted to fly. And one of them ended up having eyesight problems, and the other another medical problem. They couldn't pass the physical, so they didn't get to fly. But both of them became mechanics during the war. And actually, one was a P-38 mechanic, the plane my father flew. He spent, just to give you an idea, because I questioned him about this, he repaired the P-38s, the fighter planes that were coming back after they would go out on a mission. He repaired the cowling on the engines. That's the sheet of metal sort of round that goes over the engine. That was his job. That one piece is what he did for the entire 3 years that he was at war. So that meant every day there were more and more of these pieces coming in. There was somebody else fixing the tail and somebody else fixing the wing. And it was just, I couldn't believe that that's what he did day in and day out for years. It just told you how many planes were coming back needing to be repaired. So they didn't, but they had wonderful stories, and they were included in my book. Now, they also were guys who quit before they even got there. And this, again, boggles my mind. One of the guys who was flying, they would go up to the Northeast and then cross over and land in England. He decided halfway across the country, you know what? I don't want to go. I don't want to be a pilot anymore. Now, I don't know exactly how you do that without getting court-martialed and put in the brig, but he quit, changed his mind. He didn't quit the Army, but he wasn't going to fly. Two men in this one group that I'm talking about, got to Maine and got ill, and they had to stay behind, and they never ended up getting it. I mean, they got well, but they didn't go, they were grounded there, and that spent the rest of their life, I guess, in the US. One guy arrived pretty close to the end of the war. It was March, April, and the war in Europe ended in April 45. He got there a couple of weeks. He didn't know the war was going to end, but people kind of had the idea that it was going to be over. So what does he do? He goes AWOL. He leaves the base. He lands and says, I'm going down to the bar and drink. I mean, this thing is over. I don't want to fly anymore. Well, they found him and they put him in jail in the brig. Another guy was riding around base in the dark on a bicycle and broke his arm. Yeah, and so after 2 missions he was. So a lot of reasons people didn't go, and a lot of reasons they might have been removed from flying status. But I think the thing you remember, as I said, everybody wanted to fly. It's that they just didn't realize what they were getting into. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, I want to be a pilot. Oh, I want to wear those wings. And my father, I'll tell you a little story. When my father got his wings as a fighter pilot, he said, man, in your day's language, those wings, chick magnets. Now this is my 97-year-old father saying it. He said, you go into a bar wearing those wings and every woman in there goes towards you. So that was another reason they all wanted to do it. But chick magnet or not, this is not worth getting to wear wings to find girls. This is a map in December 44, pretty close to the end of the war, of where we had bombed over in Europe. So basically, we think of carpet bombing in Vietnam or some of the more modern wars. Everything had been hit at one time or other. And so these young men who were very interested in flying didn't know what they were getting into. They didn't know what war was, and no one, including myself, can imagine. So, you hear the stories. 12 O'Clock High, Gregory Peck, heard him. Memphis Belle, if you haven't seen that movie about B-17, the first guys to finish their 25 missions. Actually, it's not the first guys, but Hollywood liked to profile these guys. They were young, handsome, so they chose that plane. It really wasn't the Memphis Belle. Lots of different stories, ones you hear, ones you've seen movies about, and you don't hear about these other guys. So back to my father-in-law. We hadn't given up, and I told you that earlier page I showed, we had the names of his crew. Now this was not too long after Google was invented. We were doing this research. So we had the names. I said, okay, give me a few names. Now don't give me John Smith. We will never find John Smith. Luckily their names weren't John Smith. There were a few more common ones, but Bill Hill and Ed Scapin, Carl Dobbins. We started searching just blindly searching on the internet, and found names, and we started calling. You know, I had a few bizarre phone calls because they weren't these guys, but ended up contacting these five, and were able to either talk to them or their widows. And the first thing, we talked to them, get to know them a little bit. Some of them would send us photos. And then my husband said, "Can you tell us about his last flight?" And they said, "He went home early." And we said, "Well, yeah, we knew that," and we'd ask him again, or we'd wait a few minutes, we'd come back. "Now, can we go back to that last flight? What do you remember?" "He went home early." Now, these were 5 different phone calls, and all of them said the same thing. So my husband was very disappointed, and it wasn't till much later I said, "You know what? I think they did something far more beneficial to his story than telling you what happened on that flight. What does it matter?" He couldn't go on any longer for whatever he had seen or whatever had happened, however he could deal with it. His crew remembered him for who he was, and they said, "He was my friend, he was a great pilot, he was a good person." And that's basically what they told us. So I said, you know, that makes a better story than whatever might have happened on that last flight. And I say, and I borrowed Shakespeare's words. A lot of people think this came from Band of Brothers. This quote did not. It came from William Shakespeare in Henry V. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." And a lot of people think that's Army only. It's William Shakespeare, and I thought it still was the very perfect thing, because that's what these guys were, his band of brothers, and they stood up for him in his memory. So that became a gathering of men, which both books, thankfully, very much, I'm very proud, they both received the Military Writers Society of America's Gold Medal, one in 2021, the first book, and then this one in 2022. So I am delighted to present both of those to you, little tidbits from each one. There's much, much more in them. The one on the right, my most recent one, I wanted to write it as a nonfiction book, to be perfectly factual, as I had done on the first one. But because we didn't know what happened on that last day, and you can't just make it up and say, well, that's what happened, people would question you, and no publisher would touch it if it was a nonfiction book. So I wrote it as a historical fiction novel, but everything in there is the exact truth, the exact dates of when he took his missions. The one other thing I did, there are a number of people, because I'm telling it as a story of 3 young men who grow up wanting to be pilots. So they grow up in a small town, and there's a barber, and there's a police chief, and then they go off to war, and they meet various other people. Everyone in the book is named for one of the actual men, or the women, in the case nurses, who were in the 100th Bomb Group. So at the back of the book, I actually tell you who they were. So if the barber was John Smith, at the back of the book, I tell you who John Smith was in England during that period of time. So with that, I am happy to answer any questions, talk to you about anything else you might have be curious about. Anyone? Okay. Well, yes.
So you never found out and he was able to let this go?
No, we do believe that he had a nervous breakdown on that last flight. We don't know exactly, but we do know that he was sent to a medical, one of the gentlemen who, if I can go back, Leonard Coleman, this is my father-in-law who was the pilot, this is his co-pilot. And we have met and befriended his nephew. He lives in California, and he had a few letters and a few memories from his father from his uncle, who eventually became a pilot and remembered having flown with my husband's father. So he was able to say there was a medical issue, and that he just didn't fly again. Now, he did come home to the U.S. and back to his family, and my husband, who was born when he was away in the service, and he ended up being transferred to the South Pacific and flying again in Australia out of combat. It was after the war was over in the Pacific. He flew, was helping move planes around because we had all this equipment overseas, and he would be moving a plane from one place to another for the Air Force, but it was not in combat. And that's as close as we came, and we said, you know, that's good enough. We were very happy to honor him and his crew in the story. So yes.
Did you make any effort to ask the family for a copy of their service records?
We had an envelope with some scattered things, but they were so helpful. He had 3 uniforms in his possession when he went overseas. He had a gun, a shaving kit, 3 handkerchiefs. I mean, it was amazing what the Army cared about at that point in time. We had his discharge papers, but nothing. It was very hard for us even to find out that he had the removed from flying status till we dug in and found some records, and after that, there was nothing else left. And he was gone, and his wife was still living, but she didn't remember, and of course didn't know what might have happened over in Europe. But it was a long time ago, so. Well, thank you very much. I'm happy if there are no other questions. Yes.
I want to know what you're working on now.
Oh, well, there is a 3rd book, a new one that will be nonfiction. It takes a couple years, well, maybe a year to write a book, a couple of years to get it published and out in the public. It is about World War II. It is another story that you haven't heard, and it is globally, so it really touches the war as it's going on in the Pacific, Europe, South America, China, all around the globe. And so it turns out to be a massive research. I mean, I love research, but this one is probably bigger than both of those combined, so it's taking a little bit longer. But I'm meeting some fascinating people, and I'm very happy to do yet another book. And as I said, thank all of our veterans and military families. Is there anybody in here besides me who was in a military family, raised and had to move around? Nope. Well, you missed something. Okay.
Is that what got you interested in the?
That and my father being a World War II pilot, and of course my father-in-law, who I never knew, but having the same experience. So I think after writing one, I got hooked on that and did another one, and now once you sort of know something, it's a lot easier to keep moving down in that genre. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rona, for sharing those stories and just kind of whetting our appetite about different stories that we may not have had the opportunity to hear with World War II. It is always fascinating to me. I haven't been part of a military family, so I'm always very interested to know how families interact with those stories as well. And thank you to all of our audience for attending this evening, and to our friends of the library for providing refreshments. And we hope to see you again at one of our other Meet the Author series events. Thank you.